Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that you could be here today. And I'm Kate Baumann with the Metro Hartford Alliance. And today we appreciate you joining our Metro Hartford Alliance Pulse of the Region event. As we get started, we would first ask for each of you to fill out a one-question anonymous poll. So you should be seeing that on your screen right at this moment. So if you could take a moment, just fill that out, and then we will start diving into all the fun stuff today. Perfect. And as we get going, you can still, if that is not cleared off your screen, you can still click submit on that. And we'll just run through a couple housekeeping items before we get started today. Just so everyone knows, everyone is muted and you will be off camera. So we are in webinar mode. We will be using the Q&A module, not the chat function. So if you do have a question, we encourage you to put that in the Q&A module located right at the bottom of your screen. If you do have any issues with audio, visual, please put those into the chat module and we'll be sure to acknowledge those. Following the event today, we will be sending an email with links to any information referenced, additionally some further information about upcoming events as a follow-up to today. Again, we're thrilled to have you here today, and without further ado, I will kick things over to our President and CEO of the Metro Hartford Alliance, David Griggs.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everyone. I'd rather be addressing you from a podium instead of a Zoom screen while you enjoyed your coffee, but the Metro Hartford Alliance can still help keep our audience connected via Zoom for now. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has many challenges, but it has given us the opportunity to rebrand our Alliance breakfasts. They're now called, as you may have heard, Pulse of the Region Connect events. And welcome to our second event. Throughout the year, our Pulse Connect events will showcase a variety of topics, including a conversation with Mayor Bronin on March 9th. We'll also continue to increase awareness and focus on solutions to building strong, inclusive cultures throughout our region's ecosystems. In our workplaces, talent pipelines, businesses, and supply chains. So stay tuned. We received positive feedback from our first Pulse Connect event, creating a diverse and inclusive culture. Attendees let us know they gained valuable insight and suggestions. That helps us know we're on the right track. Another big takeaway from that event was the need to continue the conversation. Like many of you, the MHA is on our journey to increase awareness within our own team, to impact the way we operate within our roles and our organization, and to support our community. During our last Pulse Connect event, moderator Barbara Ramirez-Carrez, Second Vice President of Enterprise Diversity and Inclusion for Travelers, questioned whether this is a moment or a movement. We cannot let this be a moment. It has to be a movement. And a movement requires action. We also know that action requires collaboration. So last summer, the MHA formed a Racial Equity and Economic Development Leadership Committee, which includes voices from local corporations, nonprofits, and educational institutions. I'm proud to be part of this committee, along with our team lead, Raina Giddings, who is MHA's Senior Director of Investor Relations, along with other committee members, Andrew Glassman from Pullman and Comley, Floyd Green from CVS Aetna, Duncan Harris, Capital Community College, Andrea Hawkins, leading Culture Solutions, who joins us on our panel today. David Hopkins, the Urban League of Greater Hartford, Maria Lino from the Latino Way, Tara Spain from Travelers, Kelvin Thomas from the Hartford, and Jay Williams, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. Our committee is dedicated to creating an impactful agenda and determining how the MHA can take action. We had many meetings which helped us recognize that we needed to identify opportunities for improvement, both in our community and within our organization. I mentioned collaboration. We're grateful not only for our committee members, but today's panelists, who all offer unique insight. We're also grateful for you, our attendees. We realize major challenges can't be instantly resolved. Our region needs to collaborate to work toward common goals. Our journey to create a diverse and inclusive workplace culture is a process that won't be accomplished with one discussion or one event. We're glad you're along with us on this journey. Before I turn it over to our presenter, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Raina Giddings, who I mentioned is our committee team lead and Senior Director of Investor Relations here at MHA. I know she'll moderate an inspiring conversation with our panelists. Raina is passionate about finding ways to enhance diversity and inclusion efforts, not only in our organization, but in organizations throughout the region. And now to introduce our presenter, Joelle Murchison, Principal and Founder at Exec Mommy Group, a coaching practice focused on inclusion, public speaking, communication, and leadership. Joelle is a diversity and inclusion champion who believes every human interaction is an opportunity to advance dialogue. Thank you for joining us this morning, Joelle.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here with some of my favorite people this morning on this panel. I was tasked with the opportunity to kick us off, to build a bridge from the first session that occurred last month to our topic today, starting your journey to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'd like to share with you a quote that's appropriate as we begin this conversation in the midst of Black History Month. And it's a quote from James Baldwin. He said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but certainly nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I believe that that is the moment that we stand at that will allow this opportunity to not be just a moment, but indeed a movement. Your journey to diversity, equity, and inclusion is just beginning, perhaps. I can't wait to see the results of the poll. But one of the things that I wanted to be sure that we talked about as I kick off this tremendous panel of colleagues today is some of the things that you as an organization should be prepared to think about as you begin this journey. In my experience, having led diversity and inclusion, both in the corporate sector and in higher education, there are a few things that I know to be true. One of them is the fact that it is critical for each of us to be very clear about what we mean when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is critically important to identify what it is that we will tackle. And so it is most important that within your organization, there is universal understanding of the task at hand. If you've done previous diversity education work and you believe that there are individuals in the organization who do understand what diversity actually means, I would encourage you to check again. Ensure that there is alignment. What is, in fact, the issue that we are trying to address? Who are we as an organization? There are some questions, perhaps, that we should consider. What is it that we are actually beginning? And who's accountable? Leadership, which we will discuss today, is also extremely critical. Who is going to lead the initiative and who will be held accountable for its outcomes? You also want to do a deep dive, to do some inquiry, to think about where you are today, what is the current state of your organization, and where it actually is that you would like to go. In that process, it may mean having conversations that bring voices to the table that have never been there before. And so it's important that you prepare yourself to have those dialogues and prepare yourselves to get a little bit uncomfortable. You see, these topics did not just emerge after the murder or killing of George Floyd in June. These topics have been with us for a very long time, and it certainly will not be addressed overnight. And so it is really important for us to understand that while we are here today, these conversations have had a life before we arrived. And so sometimes those conversations, though difficult, are critically important to your organization's growth. It's important to uncover and identify some of our blind spots. What are things that we've missed in the process of getting to the desired outcomes and goals for our organization? What resources are available in order for us to support this work? Do we have what we need within our organization, or do we need some help in order to be able to support this work? Those are all questions for you to consider as you begin this journey. Now, as I referenced, this is not the beginning of this dialogue, certainly in the context of our nation, but it may in fact be the beginning of this intentional dialogue within your organization. I'm grateful that over time, we as a society have moved from a process of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a nice to have, as an opportunity for us simply to be compliant with any legal ramifications or to avoid any possible legal action. We now know very clearly that it's much more than celebration and recognition, that it is indeed an opportunity for us to be inclusive and to bring each voice to the table. This is now your opportunity to move your organization along this continuum. It is your opportunity to embrace inclusion, to begin to leverage opportunities within the organization and all of the individuals who bring value each day, and then to activate your organization to leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion for your ultimate success and competitive advantage. And so today, my esteemed colleagues and I will help to navigate you through some of those questions that you might want to begin to explore. We will help you to think about what steps you need to take to begin your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. So at the outset, awareness. I talked about developing a common language and getting clear understanding about what it is, in fact, that you needed to tackle. Inquiry, asking those hard questions. As I like to say, peeling back the layers of the onion. What is it that we know? And what is it that we don't know? Perhaps understanding some of the data, representation within your organization, policies and practices in the way that they unknowingly may hamper your efforts towards diversity and inclusion. And then once you've done that deep dive, developing a plan. What are the steps that we need to take to move forward in terms of the organization's DEI strategy? Then, of course, my friends, it is the time to take action. And so this morning, we will have an opportunity to move you beyond this moment, to help you then begin a movement that will allow your organization to uncover your opportunities around diversity, equity, and inclusion and move towards success. Now, I will tell you, you may want to hold on. It is not going to be an easy ride. There are likely going to be conversations that make you a bit uncomfortable. Sometimes you may need to step away for a moment, but always come back. And most importantly, always continue to ask the questions to move your organization to success. So with that, I will turn it over to our colleague, Raina Giddings, who will lead this illustrious panel through today's conversation. We do hope that you all will be engaged and ask questions, and we'll certainly do the best we can to address them in the context of our remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, David, and thank you, Joelle, for that amazing presentation and helping lay the foundation for our discussion today. This morning, we are talking to DEI consultants who are successfully leading workplace diversity in many of our organizations. When you first came on this morning, you saw a poll, and in order for us to understand where everyone is on their journey, we asked you to answer the following question. What stage are you in your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And here are the results. So 15% are just getting started. 48% said that they are starting, or they have started, but they're still figuring things out. And then 37% said that it's not perfect, but we're doing well. No one raised their hand to be a speaker. So that's why we're all here, right? To learn and grow together. And we are all being challenged to show up in our leadership in a way that we have never been challenged before. And as David mentioned at the Metro Hartford Alliance, we're learning right along with other organizations. And so we'd like to thank our esteemed panel of experts for being here today and being able to share some of your experience and guidance. So with that, let's get started with you introducing yourselves. Give us your name and your company, and we will provide everyone with your bios and materials after the event. As a friendly reminder, it was mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please be sure to put those questions in the Q&A module, and I promise that we'll get to as many questions as possible. So with that, Wendy, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Kenya, Jamal, and Andrea.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Wendy Helmkamp. My company is Moonshadow Consulting, and the focus of my work is to strengthen the health of organizations that are committed to impacting people in positive ways and equity and having a positive impact on society.
My name is Kenya Rutland. I'm privileged to be the Chief Enthusiasm Officer at KJR Consulting, where the last 21 years we spent a lot of time getting people excited about working better together and then trying to provide the tools to make that happen. And in an OD world, one of the big topics has been over these last 20 years, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Excited to be here today and really being part of a great panel.
Jamal?
Good morning, folks. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Jamal Jimerson, serving two roles, basically. One is the executive director, founder and executive director of a nonprofit called the Minority Inclusion Project, where we're focused on helping nonprofit organizations really work through some board diversity challenges. I'm also the chief equity officer for Thought Partner Solutions, a consulting firm. Our focus with Thought Partners is really on providing high-level advisory services to organizations that are looking to advance ideas, what we call racial ideas, which is an acronym for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Solutions. So we work with nonprofits and foundations, small and large businesses, leveraging what we call a React for Change anti-racism framework. So excited to be here, looking forward to sharing some really positive information with folks and hoping to get you inspired to get on the journey.
And last but not least, Andrea.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Hawkins. I'm the founding partner of Leading Culture Solutions. And I work with organizations and I help them with strategic planning, organizational effectiveness, and culture transformation, all with an intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And so my organization uses a proprietary 4L model: listen, learn, lean in, and live, to help organizations understand how to make their journey, start their journey, and make progress on their journey of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm so excited to be here this morning. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's kick it off with the first question, just relating to starting your journey. Kenya, when we talk about starting the journey, where do we begin? How does an organization prepare to make these changes?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Raina, again, for having us on the panel. And I wanted to start with something that I think is somewhat a flip on the question, if you don't mind, and it is the idea of where do we get started. Joelle laid out a really powerful message as it relates to all the components. But one thing that I wanted to throw out as a starting point is maybe what not to do. One of the challenges that I'm sure my peers have seen is organizations hearing, we need to get on the journey. So let's go hire a DEI officer today, or hire somebody that is a partner that we're going to throw in the role. And we're really not prepared with a plan of what we want to do with them, how we want to leverage their skills, or what we want to set them up for success with. And so what that sounds like is the awesome job you give me with no C-suite support or no budget, or I'm the HR person and the DEI person, or I might be the head of janitorial services and the DEI person. And I mean that with no facetious aspect. I've seen it all. So being sure that whoever, whatever you're starting your journey with, it doesn't start with a person. You have to have that commitment, like Joelle's opening comment said, already in play, so that that person comes into the space knowing that the organization is ready. So with that out of the way of mistakes to avoid, I would just throw in maybe two other quick things and let my colleagues share along the way as well. First off, it would be, as Joelle mentioned, and I don't mean to keep going back to her comments, but she laid it out so well, defining your organization's why. Why are we getting into this work? And I think this is, again, the C-suite looking and saying, we are going to do this, and this is what it's going to look like. I'm saying it starts in the C-suite, but obviously that involves bringing along the rest of your team, because I think a bottom-up approach in this work certainly is important. Knowing why it matters, knowing what the status quo means, and also knowing that you're not just hopping on the fad, because last May and June, there were a lot of organizations that said, we're in. And it's almost May and June of 2021, and some of them haven't done anything. And this is not to point the finger, but maybe it was because we didn't have the right focus or commitment from the get-go. I would also add maybe looking and defining the future state of where you want to go. And so this is thinking about, where do we want to be as an organization? My friend Andrea just talked about having that intentional DEI component in her work. And I love the last L was live. So if we're going to be living it, what does live look like for us? And thinking about that and seeing that future, so that as we start building, we can get ourselves there. And then maybe the last thing I would throw out quickly is the idea of ensuring that right away you get your leaders involved. And I would argue, even as a practitioner or a firm that provides training, that doesn't start with training. I like to think of it starting with conversations and experiences where we can say, hey, Raina, hey, Kenya, hey, whomever else is leading, let's have some discussions to see where we are. What's your lived experience? Here's a journey we're looking to get on. I need you on board. Let's talk through that. Then we roll out a strategy with the right partner, with our DEI person that's been set up for success, or whatever that is, but we're moving along in a way that is thought about, is thought through, and it makes sense. And it's also sustainable. It's not a one-off. And I would pause with that to see if anybody else has anything they'd like to add.
Joelle?
Well, I think, Kenya really laid out, particularly thinking about those things not to do. And I can't echo enough leadership. I guess this is a perfect opportunity for me to give a shout out to one of my former organizations, Travelers. When I joined the organization as the Chief Diversity Officer, one of the most critical components that was in place was that there was a CEO who was deeply committed to diversity and inclusion. Didn't know all the answers, was extremely authentic about it, but had a personal connection, a real deep understanding of why this work made sense. Jay Fishman framed it as, I know that there is an important space for us in providing opportunities for folks. People did it for me. I need to make sure that we can do it for others. So acknowledging immediately that there was not universal access for everyone in the context of the organization. And I think that critical awareness coming from the leader was absolutely essential to the organization getting on board. When leadership is trusted and committed, everyone will begin to fall in line and or ask the questions that will help them to get there. So I can't emphasize enough the critical importance of leadership commitment, and then certainly, really setting up the individual who's responsible, because there needs to be someone who can shepherd the work, but really setting them up for success and providing them with the access and the authority to do what needs to be done to unturn those stones and to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you so much. There's clearly a lot to be considered here. Jamal, what are some of the challenges that that organizations should normally be expecting during this time when they're doing the work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a broad range. I mean, I'm inclined to bring it back to some of the beginning issues, some of the root issues. What we find is that at the root, one of the first things that an organization needs to acknowledge is that there are systemic inequities, there is institutional and systemic racism that has existed both now and throughout history, that has led to the conditions that we see. You know, diversity, or the lack thereof, is a manifestation of years and years and years of doing it wrong. And so, you know, fundamentally, in order to really begin to engage in a meaningful effort, a meaningful journey towards diversity, equity, inclusion, racial equity, racial inclusion, there needs to be a complete and total acknowledgement of some of the root issues, some of the root problems. And what we find is that oftentimes the biggest mistake that organizations make is that they rush to put a Band-Aid essentially on a gunshot wound, that they're moving to put solutions in place, solutions that are oftentimes superficial, that are addressing surface level issues, or their focus is on the optics of diversity, on the nature of appearing as though, you know, we call faux diversity or faux equity, fakequity, this idea that we want to appear as though we are progressive, we want to appear as though we are solving a problem. But all of us know that we cannot go to a doctor and get a meaningful solution to our problem, to our issue, if we don't talk about our medical history. And so that's pretty much the same approach that we need to take when it comes to addressing some of our inequities, and diversity being one of them, or the lack thereof, is that we have to take a meaningful look at our past. We have to look honestly and openly at our present. And we have to talk, as my colleague Kenya mentioned, we have to talk openly and honestly about where we want to be in the future, and really reimagining what the world should look like if we were equitable, inclusive, and more diverse. So there's a lot there, but I would say the root of it is a pure lack of acknowledgement of how deep the problem really goes, and how to effectively be able to solve some of those root issues.
Andrea, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. So agreed, right? And I think when you think about what diversity brings to an organization, it brings a lot of different people, a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives, right? And if we're doing it right, we're going to have more conflict. So I think there's a fear of getting started, right? There's a fear of really leaning into it, because there are enough of us, right, and people in the world that are afraid of conflict. We don't want conflict, and we definitely don't want conflict in our workplaces. So I think an important first piece of the work is making sure that your organization is equipped to manage the conflict that's going to emerge by inviting new voices and different voices to the table that will offer different perspectives. So you just got to make sure you're doing these foundational things to make sure that the organization is prepared for these conversations, tough conversations, conversations that are going to bring up emotions. It used to be that we would say, come into the office, but leave your life at home. But guess what? This pandemic has caused us to be inside of everybody's life, right? We all see how people live. If we don't have a green screen behind us, this is not a green screen. This is really my dungeon or my office, or however we want to refer to it, right? So we are judging each other and how we're living and so forth. So this idea of diversity is going to bring more conflict. And as an organization, there's a healthy amount of fear. I want to just close with saying, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So if we don't lean into that fear, and if we don't prepare ourselves and have some of those conversations, there will not be progress. So, I would just encourage, every organization that's thinking about it to lean into it and work it. It's a step forward, a step forward, a step forward, a half step back, some more steps forward, but you will make progress over time.
Thank you so much.
Brandon, can I add just one more point here?
Yes.
Is, just to kind of extend on this idea of fear, one of the things that we find is that there's oftentimes a fear of failure. And the fear of failure is sometimes what makes us apprehensive, particularly as it pertains to some of these more sensitive conversations around inclusion and race and gender and all of these kind of ideas of what we call protected classes. There's oftentimes a fear of doing it wrong. You know, how do I know what to say? What if I say the wrong thing? For what we find for a lot of folks is we don't want to appear as though we're biased. We don't want to appear as though we are racist. We're trying to pick and choose every word so we can sound perfect, so we can sound great, so we don't feed into the myth that all of us are thinking one way or another way. And the reality of it is that, you know, I tell people this all the time. Right now we have about 12 or 13 different iPhones, generations of the iPhone. You don't get to generation 12 or 13 unless you failed 11 times before that. In other words, you need to embrace the idea that failure is a component of evolution. And so we have to fail. We should embrace the idea that we've done it wrong, that we've done diversity wrong, that we've done inclusion wrong. Not as an end game, not to say, well, we've done it wrong and then we just stop, but we've done it wrong. And so what can we learn? How can we evolve? How can we dramatically improve? Going back to some of the principles of Ray Dalio here, it's like literally, what can we learn from our mistakes? How can we dramatically improve? And then in the next iteration of what we do, we come back better. So as opposed to looking at failure as something we want to avoid, that we begin to walk towards the idea that failure is okay, that it's a part of our ingredients for success.
I love this because in our last event, Nicole Huey mentioned, gone are the days where, you know, you could not talk about race, right? It was a taboo to talk about race, politics, and religion. And now things are changing where you have to bring your whole self to work and you have to figure out how to do that. So I think that's really interesting, Jamal. Thank you. All right.
If I can, I'm sorry, Raina, just to take Jamal's point just one step further, the importance of language. You know, we talked about, you know, creating spaces to have this dialogue, right? We recognize that there are going to be these difficult conversations that you're going to need to have. Many of them have been festering, right? And so, you know, when you take the Band-Aid off of a wound the first time, it hurts. And you still need to tend to it. You need to clean it. You need to make sure, to take this medical analogy a little bit further, right? But also you need to determine language, and you can't allow the language to prevent you from having the conversation. Too often I hear people say, well, what should I say? Is it okay to say Black? Should I be saying BIPOC? What does that mean? And instead of asking the questions, they don't say anything at all. So not allowing your lack of knowledge to prevent you from exploring the conversation, and recognizing that, you know, just as Jamal shared with the analogy related to the iPhone, that language is also emerging and it changes over time. And so you do need to be intentional about your own awareness journey and your own education. Your organization should not be responsible for providing you all of the information that you need. You, individual colleague who is responsible or leading or part of this team, should hold yourself accountable for doing the work, ensuring that you are reading, listening to podcasts. There's so much information that's available that there's really not an excuse for us to simply check out of the conversation for fear of saying the wrong thing. So learn the language, get into it, ask questions, and to the point, maybe you trip a little bit, but don't allow that to prevent you from having the conversation.
That's awesome. So that leads me to our next question on accountability. Wendy, we're seeing a trend in pledges, stated commitments, for example, the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, 110, Goldman Sachs, NASDAQ, and many others, where there are more CEOs that are sharing the accountability now with HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion organizations in an effort to deliver a more representative workforce. What does leadership accountability look like?
Yeah, and I clearly don't follow the rules that well, so never been one of my strong suits. So I'm gonna circle back and just what I was honing in on here is referring to whiteness, white leadership. And I think that's another fear place that we have, or really a place of discomfort, as others were saying, is really being able to recognize and embrace that white people have an identity. And I know in my own personal journey, that wasn't always that was my privilege not to see it for a really long time. And it was really through a lot of the self-work that I started off by saying that allowed me to identify that and what came along with seeing whiteness, seeing the privileges that I have, and being able to do, really do some of that self-work, which is something that I think in the context of training, in the context of learning that we're talking about here, one of those accountabilities are really for white leaders to do that work. And I also started talking about, at the interpersonal level, which is what, my colleagues here have been naming in terms of these difficult conversations that need to happen. And it requires empathy, it requires vulnerability, it requires making mistakes and being to pick yourself up again from those mistakes. And I think the other piece about when I think about white leadership accountability at the interpersonal level, it is also about centering the voices of colleagues, of other people who have historically been marginalized. And what does that mean? It might mean, a challenge that you need to think about is, the next time that you're in a meeting as, the white leader with colleagues of color, be the last one to talk or offer your opinion last. Notice who's talking, notice who's not talking in those contexts. And really notice the patterns that are taking place and how you as a leader can shift those. And then, this is also about listening. It's about being truly open and curious to what your colleagues have to say. And I was talking again about the frame that I like to think about in terms of how to look at this, the personal, the interpersonal. At the institutional level, we really need to talk about power and authority, because at that level, those are the roles where power resides. And it's the power to allocate resources, to make investments. It's the power to hire, the power to promote, the power to decide who our strategic partners are going to be, the power to decide who our vendors are going to be. And even deciding at that level who gets to hold that power, who gets to make those decisions. So white leadership accountability here is really thinking about how to redistribute power in ways that are more equitable so that those who are not white and who have less power and influence can get it. And then lastly, at the cultural level, because as I mentioned, because most organizations have historically been led by white people, and we're talking through the centuries where Black and brown people and Asian Americans could not even work in the corporate environment for a really long time, especially not in moving into senior level roles. So because of that, there are norms and standards that have been established in our environments, in organizational environments stemming from this white heritage, that are believed to be the right way or the best way of doing things for running organizations, for conducting business. So for example, and this comes from the work of Tema Okun, which we should definitely get out to you. An example of that kind of norm or standard is if you can't measure something, it holds no value, or it's not okay to show strong emotions at work, or it's not even okay to say, I don't know. And this all contributes to what Tema Okun has noted as a white supremacy culture in our organizations. And so what is this connection to leadership accountability? For me, when I think about culture, I like to say that how goes leadership, so goes the culture. So leadership accountability here is really to examine the norms and the standards that you and your team are upholding as true and right, and making room for other ways of getting the work done or being with one another, which have equal value. And then lastly, I'll say about this, this is the hard truth potentially, is that the accountability can also mean looking at the leaders in your organization, and if there's anyone who is not able or not willing to change, potentially making the hard decision on whether they're still a fit for where you want to take the organization when it comes to equity and inclusion. And I love the message that Ibram Kendi gives in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's telling us that if you're not working to disrupt or dismantle racism, then you're supporting it. So this is really tough decisions that are required by our leaders as well. I'll stop there and invite my colleagues to jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to have Joelle weigh in. You know, you're a consultant now, but you worked in corporate America for some time. So I'd love to get your input as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Wendy hit the nail on the head in many, many ways. And I think it's important as well to hear the voice of, as she describes, you know, white accountability within the context of the organization, and really acknowledging the presence of power and decision making in the context of how to dismantle systemic racism that exists within our organizations, that for many, many years, as Wendy alludes to, many of us, including those of us who are members of underrepresented groups, have sort of lived in and supported the power dynamic and the structure that exists that allows systemic racism to be pervasive. And I think, you know, that is a hard pill to swallow, to be very honest. And I think many people believe and take it personally, in the sense that, you know, that somehow we are asking people to atone for the sins of old that may or may not have been created by their direct action. I think the opportunity there is not to look back to assess blame, but to look forward to determine what actually you can do proactively to change the system as you move forward. That really is the opportunity. With knowledge comes power. And when you know better, you do better. And so what I think, you know, I would assert, along with Wendy's comments to my colleagues who are in leadership and in power, is to acknowledge now the opportunity that you've had, maybe in a much more explicit way than you ever had before, to hear and lean into this information that perhaps is new to you, but should not be allowed to keep you in the place where you've been. It should encourage you to ask questions, to be curious, and to create space for change. That's the opportunity. No room for you to sit around and think about guilt. Let's not worry about assigning blame. Let's move forward positively with the knowledge that we now have. That's the opportunity.
Kenya?
So I would just,
Andrea.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks, Kenya. So we've been dipping into race here, right? Because of the events of last summer that occurred, right? And for years and years, there have been these issues. And I'm going to even expand it out a little bit broader and just say, you know, thinking about underrepresented populations in your organization and giving light to those populations is really important, right? Because as soon as we start having a conversation about race, someone wants to jump in and say, well, you know, I didn't have resources, and, you know, it's not this and it's not that, right? Without really recognizing the privilege that comes along with race. But I want to expand that to have us think about many of the underrepresented groups, and an activity that I know I like to do with leaders when I'm working with executive leaders. One of the activities that's part of some work that we do together is about having those leaders who are primarily white men still in 2021, but now a few more white women, go and be in places and in spaces where you are the only one that looks like you, right? And submerge yourself in that and see how that feels for yourself. Think about how you're treated and really experience it and go deep. And then I have them come back together and we talk about that. And we talk about what the experience was like for them to be that one person that was a way that was different than the majority of people that are in the room. In this work, we like I said, we've been leaning into race a little bit more here, but I want everyone to sort of think about it. You know, I approach the work assuming that there's a lot for everyone to know, and everyone's going to be in different places on this journey around, right, to get to inclusion, which is our ultimate goal right here. But the process is a crawl, stand, walk, run. When we start talking about anti-racism, we're over here and run. But if you don't have the skills to crawl, if you can't stand, and if you don't know how to walk, how do you talk about anti-racism? So there's an important foundation that every organization needs to have in order to make progress on this journey. And while you can move past some steps, eventually you have to go back and master some of those steps, right? So it's really, really important to just remember this is a journey. It is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It will take time. But some of the foundations around, I talked about the 4 L's. The listen is about what is your current state of DE&I. The learn is about let's talk language and let's make sure we're not crossing each other. If I say diversity and you say diversity, do we mean the same thing? And if not, let's get on the same page about language and history for some of these underrepresented groups and business case, like how's it going to help us in the organization? And once everyone is on the same page with that learn, then you can lean in, right? Then you can start thinking about implicit bias. So some organizations try to start with that, but I say it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, right? It's like, if you don't have the language for that conversation or any semblance of self-awareness, how do you do bias training? So it's really important to have some of those foundational pieces. And then finally, the live piece is about what does your mission, vision, and values say about diversity and inclusion? Is it embedded, right? Because if it is, then you will include it in your strategy. You will make sure, and this is to answer one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A, you will make sure you're holding people accountable by making sure it's embedded in everyone's competencies, and you will have diversity metrics that are important to make sure you're monitoring your progress on the journey. So I just wanted to just offer that and just remind us that we are on a journey, and it is a marathon and not a sprint.
Thank you. And so I have another question for you, Andrea. How do we know now that we're making progress or moving the needle? How do we measure ourselves against other organizations?
Great. And I want to invite Kenya's voice because I think he had something to offer for that last question.
Well, hey, listen, this is the power of being in a great panel like this. I was like in school. I'm like, I'm just going to listen, sister. So listen, what I will throw out, I'm going to stick with what you asked, Raina, about the data here. But Andrea, what I would just say on that piece, because it carries over, was a concept around empathy and the idea of we sometimes find that when there are those moments of oops, we will make excuses for some people in ways that we don't for all. And I think that goes across all of those groups that you're referring to. So for my white men on the line, especially, I would highlight, as Joelle said earlier, engage, dive in, but we're all going to fall down. And when we fall down in organizations, don't be guilty of the empathy effect of, oh, well, he gets off in this scenario differently than other people would be. And then I bring it to how do we know we're doing well or how we assess? I think there are so many different data metrics. And I love what was said in the last point, which was around the idea of we have to embed it in our organization and the norms, embed it in the way we might practice our performance management systems and things like that. But also, I would argue, I'm not a big fan of numbers being necessarily the way we do that, because obviously it's really easy to start tokenizing people, getting the trifecta when you have the gay Black woman who works for you, ... We've seen it all come up. Two things that come to mind for me right away is, I'm going to use the analogy as opposed to the system, so my peers can talk the data. But I think about the leadership shadow, and I had a potential client that we're going to be working with say to me, I need to close the say-do gap in my organization. Everybody's doing all this talking, but nobody's doing anything. And I think to Andrea's point about the run piece earlier, I was thinking this right away, and I want to be cautious even of what we did in the panel, or excuse me, in the poll today. Diversity and inclusion, equity, race equity, anti-racism. Those are all different elements of this work. And if you're on your journey and you're just crawling, there's no flaw in that. Know that your organization is there and measure that, as opposed to measuring yourself against somebody who checked in the poll that we're doing this, or maybe somebody who just didn't tell us, but they were a speaker waiting to be able to share. Well, the reality of that is you're comparing yourself in a competition that you don't need to. So I know that's not in the metrics, Raina, of like exactly what would I use to measure, but I think these are some crucial things. Don't be guilty of letting people off if they say that thing. It's not about pointing the finger, just we got to address it. then making sure that we actually in some way, form, or fashion align that say-do gap. Whatever we said, we're going to do it. And then know where your lane is. Tema Okun's work that Wendy referenced highlights that one of the rules of white supremacy culture is perfectionism. Many of us have been told we need to get grades. And, I want to make sure I do it right. And I'm competing against you trying to get the best grade. But in actuality, what's the grade if it's no good for your organization? And so I think stay in your lane, do what you need to do. Andrea laid it out very quickly, as we've learned from my parents. Crawl, then get to that marathon and whatever it looks like. So I'll start with that and throw it back to anybody else that wants to share.
Can I just jump in for those organizations who are on the call who are cringing because they're like, wait a minute, we can't track this, we can't measure this. I think there's a balance, right? And having done this within organizations previously, I think there's a couple of things that you want to think about. First, how do you measure other critical, important items, right? How do you do it? What is the methodology that you utilize? So how might you be able to adapt that methodology to your desired outcomes around DEI? I'm stressing the your because I think to Kenya's point, too many of us get caught up in, and I think someone referenced this in one of the questions that we have on deck, but we get caught up in organizations that rate and rank companies, or we get caught up in best practice sharing, right? Best practices are good practices, but they may not necessarily be the right practice for your organization. You've got to test practices against the culture of the place that you work in. Are you likely to be the kind of organization who would embrace these kinds of things, right? Maybe there are components of who you are from a cultural perspective, and that's a whole other issue in terms of, do we know who we are as an organization, right? What is our culture? But assessing that and understanding how you may be able to transfer some of the skill sets or best practices around DEI into the context of your organization. There are, in fact, some measures that you do need to pay attention to. And one of the things that I appreciated about what I've done in the past is really looking at talent as one component, not the full. I think a lot of organizations go all the way wrong when everything related to DEI is related to talent. How many people can we recruit? How many people can we retain? How many people do we promote? Yes, that is critically important, because if you do not have individuals who successfully move throughout the ranks of the organization, there is no story to be told. So how can you recruit additional folks if they don't see anyone who looks like them, who's been successful, not just a higher end, but people who've moved throughout? People don't necessarily want to jump from organization to organization to be able to climb. They'd like to be able to build and be a part of a culture and a community where they can grow and thrive. So you do have to pay attention to those things. They are critically important. I don't want to suggest that you throw those out, but I think it's critically important that you determine what are the measures that make sense for our organization, and how can we ensure that we apply similar methodology as we look at DEI. There are very much qualitative components of this DEI journey that those of you who are very quantitative organizations are just going to have to get comfortable with. And it does mean you have to talk to people and get an assessment as to how people feel. And it's not just going to be borne out in the numbers.
This is great. We have 5 more minutes before Q&A. So I'd love to ask just 2 more questions, just a few more questions if we can get it in. Once again, if you have questions, please continue to place them in the Q&A. Wendy, thank you so much. You started to have the conversation about leadership and allyship. I think just for the definition solely for people who don't know, can you please describe, what an ally actually is in the journey? And then Jamal, what is the role of others in the organization when you're talking about successfully achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if we can answer it briefly, because there's one more question that I'd like to ask everyone.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So allyship. So I want to start by saying that allyship, white allyship, must come from a place of authenticity and a real desire for change. We need to do the hard work of connecting with the experience of our colleagues of color and empathizing with them, as I've been saying, as best we can, to make sure that any actions we do in support of our colleagues of color, it's based on what they need and want, and it's not what it's not based on what we need or want or what will make us feel good. And that's when it becomes performative. And so some practical things that, just to give you a few examples of what white allies can do. We've been talking about this: learn the history and the facts behind the experiences people of color are having, and other, I would say other groups that are marginalized in our society. Learn about it externally and internally within your organization without expecting people of color to teach you. Advocate for policy changes in your organization. If you see or hear about inequities, it could be related to dress code or what hairstyles are permissible or the holidays that get celebrated. Participate in your organization's equity and inclusion initiative. It's hard to be an ally if you're not involved, and that way people will know that you are there as a potential ally. And this we've talked about a lot, the hard conversations. Have the courage to speak up on behalf of a colleague who you believe is being treated inequitably, if that's the support that they need or want from you. For instance, if you notice that they're repeatedly being talked over in meetings. Our role is not to save or rescue our colleagues. This keeps us in a dominant position and reinforces an implicit bias that people of color don't have the ability to help themselves. So one of the best ways to be an ally is really to ask, what support do you need? And really, have self-compassion as well. When you get it wrong, commit to it, as we said, keep going, keep crawling, and then walking. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jamal, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it brief but powerful. Here's what. One is that I hate to break everyone's hearts, but diversity is important, right? And I just wrote this point down, but diversity is important, but it's insufficient for addressing what Wendy pointed out, which are the deep-seated power imbalances. And so the shift in the way you do business, when we go back to the context of metrics, I just want to highlight that what we're talking about is shifting the way people look at themselves and look at their role within a system. And also we're talking about systemic transformation. And in systemic transformation, everyone plays a part. White allies, people of color, everyone in that system has a role that they can play. There's several things. One is the default assumption that people of color are somehow fundamentally aware, more aware, more conscious, more woke than white people is a false assumption. In fact, Joelle made the point that people of color operate oftentimes within a system in which racism has been endemic. And so the idea that folks of color somehow are in the know about the true impact of systemic racism or the solutions to systemic transformation is a false default assumption. There is value in having conversations with folks of color, but let's not operate off the assumption that folks of color inherently know what to do. Which brings us back to Wendy's point of why we cannot go to people of color and simply look to them for all of the solutions. It's just not that simple. So I want to highlight a few things that everyone can do in my last minute. One is elevating the positive vision and the power that folks of color and people who have different diverse identities bring to everything we do, every element of our organization. Two, centering systemic transformation while simultaneously decentering ourselves and our individual egos, because fundamentally, again, not to break your heart, but it's really not about you. It's about the whole system and the transformation of the system. Three is the vision, history, transformation, and self-determination is something that all members of the organization need to be fundamentally a part of. Get real for folks of color. It's not easy being green. It's not easy being black. It's not easy being yellow. Talk about those things. Speak out about things that they're hearing, about being a part of being a change agent. Just because we're not necessarily looking for folks of color to educate does not mean you don't have room to speak out unmasked. Educate yourselves. Again, the default assumption that people of color just know all there is to know is a false assumption. Allies and alliances matter for folks of color as well. So building alliances with folks, there is power in numbers. There's power in having people to share an experience with. So doing that, and of course, my most important tip to folks of color, and I'm going to stress this to everyone who's a person of color on the line, is to take care of yourself. Self-care is everything. When you've grown up in a system in which racism is endemic, you are dealing with an accumulation of micro inequities pretty much your entire life. And so at some point, those wounds begin to hurt, and the acknowledgement of that hurt, the acknowledgement of that pain is your right, and the acknowledgement of your need to heal is your right. So I would encourage folks to think about that. Hopefully I didn't go past 2 minutes, Raina.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have about 13 questions and we are wrapping up at 10:15. So let's see how many we can get in. So Kel asks, how do you feel about organizations including DEI factors into managers and leaders' annual assessments for promotions, compensation, and responsibilities? Who would like to take that?
I mean, I'll start, and I know others will, have things to add here. So I think Joelle said it. I think others said it. Think about how you run your business today and how you hold people responsible for carrying out whatever activities you want them to carry out. DE&I is no different, right? So you want to embed this expectation of how people are going to show up in the organization, how they're going to treat one another, how they're going to be fair and equitable to every person, how they're going to make sure that each person in that organization has what they need to be their best self every single time. So I would just offer that as, yes, included in your competencies, along with, other competencies that you have for them about how to get that job, get the work done every day.
Great. Next question from Kim. How do you prepare for the conversation with HR consultants?
So was that in terms of I see the question. I'm assuming that it's in terms of the dialogue more broadly, like how do you begin this conversation? I think to that specific point, you need to, I think this is one of the questions that I had shared earlier on in one of the slides, is determine if you have the resources within your organization to have this conversation. It's going to vary. Perhaps you have an organizational development or learning group that has the capacity to support effective and engaged dialogue, right? Maybe they can provide that support. Perhaps you have a DEI leader within the organization. Perhaps they can begin that dialogue. If you don't, then I would suggest that you seek out help. One of the things that I think all of us have seen, and it was alluded to earlier, is, folks just hiring D&I folks. We kind of said, don't do that. If you don't really know what you're doing as an organization, or you have not had some of those deep conversations around what you want to do, engage someone to come help you. Someone who can help, who doesn't necessarily have skin in the game and is not afraid to push you to answer some of those questions that'll get you to where you need to be. Quick, so that we can move to the next question.
Awesome. Katie asks, religion can pose unique workplace challenges often overlooked by traditional diversity programs. Institutional support for diverse religious identities and commitments can be a powerful driver in individual engagement. Do you see a need for education or training on religious diversity in the workplace?
I can jump in on that. So one of the, I neglected to mention when I did my introduction that I'm also an independent consultant with an organization called Visions Inc., which is a DEI consultancy. And the philosophy at Visions is really to really talk about race and really also take a multicultural approach, and to recognize that we have these identities that intersect with one another. And that's the notion of intersectionality that some of you may have spoken to. So I absolutely think that going into an organization and really understanding, well, what are the specific identity or social variables that are need to be addressed. It can be a race, it can be religion. So I think this is what Joelle said about taking more of that customized approach versus the best practices approach, knowing if religion is something that your organization, it's important to talk about that because there is that religious diversity, then absolutely it makes sense to include it in whatever approach you take.
Thank you. The next question, how do you address equity in the workplace? Explain what that means. Organizations understand diversity and inclusion, but equity is not often discussed. Equity is seen as a trade-off. How do you balance the conversation around equity versus fairness?
I'll take that one. Fundamentally, equity, by definition, the definition we've adopted is that it is a structural and systemic fairness. Essentially, is that we have identified invisible barriers, we've made them visible, and we've removed those structural and systemic barriers to ensure that everyone of all identities can thrive within the context of our workplace. And fundamentally, what that takes in order for it to happen is the use of what we call a racial equity lens. So I'm wearing glasses. Essentially, your racial equity lens would be the lens inside the glasses. It's how you see your work differently. Diversity is the optics. Inclusion is the idea of bringing people into a room, but it does not necessarily assure that everyone in the room is able to thrive within the system. So the thriving of folks in the system requires an acknowledgement of their difference, an acknowledgement of their identities, and an acknowledgement of the systemic barriers that have prevented folks from being able to share power, to share leadership, and to fundamentally influence the culture in a significant way. So equity is an important principle. It's interrelated to diversity and inclusion, but it is very unique and it takes a lot of work to do it well. And again, that's why we move away from the simple superficial elements of equity and just using it as a value. Equity is an action. It is a sense, it is a set of actions that leads us towards what we call justice, social justice, racial justice. Equity is the pathway to being able to get to those things in a more meaningful way.
Thank you. Next.
And the one thing I would add to, can I add one thing just for people to sort of keep in their minds, right? So we think about equality and we think about the golden rule, right? I'm going to treat you the way I want to be treated, right? So that's equality, right? I'm going to treat you the way I want to be treated. But when we think about equity, we think about the platinum rule, which is, right, I'm going to treat you the way you want to be treated. But in order for me to treat you the way you want to be treated, I have to see you. I have to understand your humanity. I have to understand what is important to you, what you value, right? So this idea of equity, taking Jamal's point one step further, is, and the only way I can really be equitable is to understand you and understand your humanity and understand how we're similar and understand how we're different. And so it's really respecting, again, that humanity. So I just wanted to offer that nuance there.
Thank you. George asks, where does the undeniable, compelling business case for DEI come into the conversation? While intangible and not easily measured, getting this right is an organizational value driver. Andrea, touch on this and would like to hear more.
I missed, it was a long question here. So let's see.
Where does the compelling business case come into play into the conversation, even though it's not easily measured?
There's so much data out there, and I certainly invite my colleagues to add to this. This is the benefit of two organizations to have more diverse teams, leadership teams, bringing different people that have different backgrounds in to solve specific problems. It has all been studied. It is out there. I'm happy to send some articles that we use to share with leaders about the business case. There is a proven improvement on ROI, your bottom line, the money that comes and stays in the organization, right, for reinvestment or other use, is increased the more diversity that you have in your organization and the more diversity that you have in your leadership, on your board, and within your leadership team. So there is plenty of data out there that makes this point around the more diversity you have will benefit the organization's bottom line. No question at all about that.
Well, thank you so much. There's one other question, but I'm going to ask the panel, maybe they can include this in their resources. And I also see some our panelists responding in writing to some of the other questions. Gail asks, what are some good resources for language and definitions? And I'm wondering if we might be able to share some of that in our follow-up email later. So, okay, the answer is fantastically, yeah, it's yes. So with that, we apologize that those are all the questions that we have today, but we have a lot more in the queue and we'll try to get those answered for you. What's been said or heard today supports the urgency of the moment to address DEI issues in every workplace. Today, more than ever, we have to make serious commitments and take concrete action, as we talked about today, to ensure success through involvement of each leader, employee, and stakeholder, and to recognize that everyone contributes to the overall value and success of the organization. On behalf of the Metro Hartford Alliance and the Racial Equity and Economic Development Leadership Committee, I'd like to thank our panel today, Joelle, Wendy, Jamal, Andrea, and Kenya, for joining us today. All of these consultants can speak on a variety of topics, and they're available to assist your organizations. As I mentioned to you, we'll be sharing their information in the follow-up email, so feel free to reach out to them. To our audience, thank you so much for attending today. We hope that this information was very helpful and you gained some insight that will be beneficial to your organization. Please mark your calendars for our upcoming Pulse of the Region Connect events. As David mentioned, we are hosting again Mayor Bronner's State of Hartford address on March 9th. And on May 18th, we will have another Travelers sponsored event focused on the talent pipeline. More details will be coming soon. And once again, if you'd like to learn more about the Racial Equity and Economic Development Committee or how you can get involved, please check our website out and or give us a call. Thank you again for your time today and have a wonderful day.